Well, Noah, Toly, I'm so glad that you're here with us here on Indiana Wesleyan's campus. And I don't know how much you've heard about our program here in the John Wesley Honors College, but we teach a bunch of classes around great questions. And so the question course that I get to teach is called Who is Our Neighbor? And I've taken the approach of thinking of neighbor as broadly, not just human neighbors, but also the rest of creation. So thinking of creation like neighbor. And the other thing I've tried to do in the class is to talk about food justice. So everything from where the food comes from and the issues on the ground locally related to the environment, but also some of those global issues of who's growing the food for us, how does it get to us, all of those questions. And so basically by a few weeks into the course, the students are on board with thinking about our global food system and specifically ways that it wreaks havoc on the environment. And so we talk about various ways of, what can I do? And so I just wanted to talk about a few of those things with you. I know in the book you're hesitant to give any kind of concrete advice about here's what every person should do, but I kind of just wanted to have a conversation about that. So in the class, one of the things students come around, some of them, is thinking about choosing more of a vegetarian lifestyle, in the understanding that the whole meat industry is part of what's causing burning down the rainforests and all of that.
Right.
And other students are more compelled by let's buy organic or let's buy from the local farmer. And so I just wanted to ask you, as someone who cares about these issues too, if those are compelling options to you when you think about some of the environmental degradation, or if there's other things that you personally try to do or encourage those in your life to do.
Sure. Well, I like all those options, partly because they all represent a transformation in our judgment and our ethics. They all represent some step that we can take as individuals. So we can buy organic, we can buy local, we can eat vegetarian if we think that's part of the solution, and especially if we're disturbed by how the meat industry increases carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, for example. One of the things I try to do a little bit in the book is move us toward a policy level conversation about that, so that we have both individual solutions in mind and also policy solutions in mind. And I think students want both. Even talking with your students earlier in the day, they wanted both. So another thing that your students can do, for example, or I've told my students they can do, is they can buy from companies that have a history of giving back to the environment, or making sure that there's lower impact on the environment than there otherwise would be if they did operations in a conventional way. Those products often cost us a little bit more. And we have to be willing to pay that. It's a bit like the sacrifice you might make if you had a farm that you were running and you were commuting further, trying to figure out how to do both of these things, which might bring a lot of joy, but has its costs. And I know that you're in that position too.
So you bring up a good point, this question of money and how much things cost. And so the students often are wrestling with the fact that, when I have more money, I could choose to buy the organic food, or I could choose to, as you talk about in the book, there's so many trade-offs. I could choose to donate that money to an organization that's going to help develop literacy in this population over here. And so again, sorry to ask you to go beyond what you do in the book, but how do you help students wrestle with, there's multiple good options, but how do I actually choose to go with this option over this option over here? Do you have any thoughts on how to deal with what you talk about there in terms of the trade-offs?
I think students, especially who are anticipating the ability to engage these issues with a different set of resources in the future, face real difficulties thinking about this, because they want to think about then and they want to think about now. Right? What can I do then when I've graduated, when I'm paying off student loans, but I have an income? This is what I'll do, but right now I can't. Right now I can't make those investments. I think students can give from their time. That's a significant investment. They can give from their time to student clubs. They can give from their time as they study. They can develop their positions on these things. That's part of investing. They can give to the community, for example, in community engagement. If there were a community garden, they might work in it, not only for their own food, but for other people to have food. So I think there are lots of options for students. They just don't all look like spending money. When it comes to the second question that you asked, which was about how do you know whether to do this thing or that thing, I don't have answers to that, as you've already mentioned. There are no clear answers that say this is the right way, this is the one way to do this. And I want to avoid that because I think that's actually against the grain of the book entirely. I think we need to choose some ways to live into this and admit that we can't do all of the things that God presents us with as options.
I mean, I think that's probably the greatest gift of this book, at least to me, and I think to the students as we wrap our minds around what you're saying. Because I'll be honest, as we were reading it, we were really confused. What does he mean that there are no self-justifying options? Or as I'm teaching my class and I'm saying, hey, students, let's talk about this option and this option, I think I did have in mind that there was, maybe a right answer, or maybe not one, but one that was better than others. And so it seems that you're really trying to push against that. And so talk to me, keep explaining, why is that good news that there's not just one right answer out there?
Sure. I think we all want the one right answer. We all want the one best way or the one solution. And sometimes we think of that in terms of the one self-justifying option. I think deep in our psyches, we think of it that way. We're waiting for the one thing that clears us of any guilt for choosing it or for not pursuing another option, essentially for giving up, undermining, destroying, or foregoing one or more other goods when we choose a certain path. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think we need to come to a transformed judgment about what that means in our lives, what its theological significance is, for example. I take it that God actually made us all finite, discrete, embodied beings who can only be in one place at one time. And what that means is that from the very beginning, before the fall and the curse, we could only be in one place at one time. We were always giving up, undermining, foregoing one or more goods to possess one or more others.
Right.
To do something, anything. To be in any one place meant not being in any other place. And then I don't take it that the new creation transforms that. I think that the new creation involves living into that in a glorified way.
Yeah.
And in the intervening time, what we have to understand is that all the options we have before us for doing good things that we can't pursue represent God's superabundant provision for us, giving us way more than we can possibly do, even at moments when it feels like we're giving up something. It feels like we're not doing every good thing. It feels like we're not justifying ourselves. Still, the abundance of possibilities in that landscape is a good gift from God.
Yeah, so if I were going to take that back into my class, say, and try to incorporate some of what you're doing in the book into how I teach the class, tell me if this is kind of a way of doing that. When we get to that place where we talk about all these options, do I buy organic, or do I support my local farmer, or do I yada yada? Basically, should I just say, yes, that's a good option, that's a good option, that's a good option. You don't have to beat yourself up about pursuing this option and then not being able to give your money to people over here. You can just go this option and feel good about going that option while also feeling good about the fact that there's other people going this way. I mean, is that a way to kind of incorporate what you're talking about into some of the choices my students are wrestling with?
It is. It's the second step, I think.
Okay.
And I left out the first step in my previous answer. So the first step, I think, is to recognize there are bad ways to encounter this and to approach the problem.
Yeah.
And bad ways to do this include taking goods for ourselves, accumulating goods for ourselves, while pushing the costs of that accumulation off onto other people. And these could be people in our immediate communities, but they could also be far off communities, vulnerable communities, voiceless ecosystems, future generations. Those are bad ways to approach this challenge. But there are a plurality of good options. There's not just one. And so when you arrive at that second position of, okay, I'm not going to just push the costs off onto others so that I can have goods for myself, but I'm going to bear costs so that others can have goods for themselves. Could involve a lot of the things you've already mentioned. I'm going to bear those costs. That's when we get to this move of, yes, all of them are okay, and you can't do them all.
Right.
And that's something we should actually be praising God for, that there's so many good things we could do and we can't do them all. And I don't think that's our tendency.
No.
I think it's against the grain, but I think it's the way to handle that.
And I really love it in the book how you connect it to the the Aeschylus play that you're talking about too. I mean, that situation was much more of a typical tragedy situation. Right. It seemed almost like they were two bad options in that case, as opposed to what we're talking about now, kind of two good options. But either way, what I've appreciated about the book was just pushing us beyond that paralysis, encouraging us. I mean, I love the title, The Gardener's Dirty Hands, and the students really enjoyed that as well, in terms of, you know, there is no way to be living this life perfectly. Like, you are going to get your hands dirty, but we loved the double meaning there too, that it's important and good to get your hands dirty, to be still acting instead of finding yourself just paralyzed by all of these either negative multiple options or positive multiple options. So I think you really have done a good contribution to my class, but also the broader sphere of people thinking about these issues. I don't know, is there one last thing that you would want to say about what you hope this book can do, or kind of your hope for moving the church into a deeper place with these conversations? Or
Sure.
Yeah.
I might mention two things.
Yeah.
You mentioned paralysis there. And the first thing I would say is our typical reactions to the situation in which we have to give up, undermine, forego, or destroy one thing to have or possess another thing, secure another thing. Our typical reactions there are denial, paralysis, which you mentioned, skepticism, moral skepticism, or nihilism, right? And the denial goes something like this: I'm not really giving up anything good when I choose this over that. And what that leads us to is actually a path toward idolatry. That leads us to the assumption that we have found the one best way. We have found the self-justifying thing. And anything that justifies us that isn't Jesus Christ, life, death, and resurrection, is an idol. The second is paralysis, which you mentioned. And that's that situation where, because you don't have the self-justifying answer yet, you just do nothing. That's not a productive way to live in the world. I don't think that's what we're called to as Christians. Because primarily we're not called to wait until we can justify ourselves. We're called to acknowledge that we can't. And then skepticism is sort of beyond those two options. It says, I recognize the problem, but I don't think there's any way to know any moral bearings that would be relevant here, because my only moral bearing is self-justification. Well, I think we need to drop that as our only moral bearing and get some other bearings. And then finally, nihilism, well, then it's meaningless. If I can't justify myself and find the one best way, then it must all be meaningless. And I don't think that's right either, and I don't think it's biblical. So I think as Christians, we need to get beyond those things. And we need to acknowledge that what God has made, the way he's made it, if all these choices and trade-offs are part of, a corollary of finitude, and he's made us finite and called that good, then we are called to recognize it as good, even when that judgment is hard for us, and to respond in Christ-like ways to the challenge before us.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.